Nick, coming to you now. I mean, infrastructure, institutional investor, public partnerships, a 5% agenda. You know, you work with pension plans within Africa and around the world. Be interested to just get your views on, you know, the institutional investor public partnership framework and the 5% agenda. And I know that you may have some views on how that could be reciprocated by global pension plans in terms of making some kind of set target around an allocation for infrastructure in Africa.
Thank you, Hubert. And I'm glad we mentioned trustees and consultants, because they play a key role in the overall asset ownership ecosystem. And even if you read the Financial Times, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, it's often disregarded. So it's the role of board members, trustees, and the role of investment consultants is often overlooked, and it's a big mistake because they play a huge role. And you know, in economics we call it the age, or in economic law it's the agency problem or issue, and there is a huge agency issue, and you have to look at the whole ecosystem. It's very important, and at least, you know, your trustees, Chuck, may not be reading the Financial Times, but at least you have trustees, and you have people on average, lawmakers and policymakers in the US at state and local level. At least they take, you know, trust law and fiduciary law seriously. Sadly, in France, we don't even have trust law anymore, even though we invented it, ironically. And in many countries, you know, they follow the French bureaucratic civil code, Napoleonic legal system, where board members and trustees don't have as much power or influence. And even though it came from French Norman law, we don't have it. It's essential to have trustees, and it's essential to have trustees who flex their muscles and take their obligations seriously, which on average in the US you tend to have. You also have it in Canada and in Australia, and it's no coincidence that if you look at the rankings of public and private pensions globally, the Canadians, the Australians, and the Americans are always ranked amongst the best. And I will argue that it's no coincidence that, you know, the two pension powerhouses across all asset classes in general, but specifically focusing on infrastructure as a new asset class, are the Canadians and the Australians, and very often Canadian public pension plans, federal, provincial, state, and local, or Australian public pension plans, and very often they are, these trustees have a legal background, or the teachers or professors who are trained in trust law, fiduciary law. That, once again, you know, being French and being based in Paris, is really amazing when you see how pension board members work. It's very important. I'm aware of time, so I'll just move very quickly. Just, you know, a few metrics. Like today, and these are all approximate metrics. So, you know, you could say that today we have between 32 and 30, you know, 37. This is 37 trillion dollars of pension assets globally, and I'm excluding sovereign funds, right? So it's purely pension. We can say like 36 trillion. And if you look at emerging markets, it's only 2.5 trillion, not counting sovereign funds, of course. And so if you look at African pension funds, it's probably, you know, 600 or 700 billion dollars. So you see the imbalance, right? But it's very important, even though African pension funds may be small in the greatest scheme of things, it's very important that they invest in infrastructure, essentially for symbolic and political reasons. And here I really want to commend what Francis is doing, because of course Senegal is not a rich country, but the mere fact that that less developed frontier nation symbolically went through the motion of setting up a sovereign fund, and that you're seeing Francis and perhaps the Caisse de Retraite, you know, the small Senegalese pension funds, put a little bit of money in modern highways, train station, airports. Symbolically, I think it's fabulous, because it's sending the right message to people like Chuck or Ian, because it's reassuring if you come from far away to see that the locals themselves put their money where their mouth is. It makes a big difference. Very quickly, there's a huge injustice, but you know, life is unjust, in the way consultants and indirectly trustees look at the world, because you know, for legal, regulatory, comfort reasons, they use benchmarks, indices. And here, I've taken, you know, the sophisticated MSCI, you know, all equity benchmark. The famous MSCI World discriminates against Africa in even worse, worse fashion. So looking at, you know, that MSCI ACW Global World Equity Index, which is supposed to take into account emerging and frontier markets, you only have 2 African nations within the benchmark, South Africa and Egypt. And that African chunk of the global equity benchmark is less than 0.4% of the total. So of course, if this is your benchmark, and if you're really benchmarking your assets using the MSCI, you know, index, mechanically, I would say, you will be under investing in Africa. It's practically mechanical. Now, looking at, you know, Africa's share of the world economy, and these are World Bank stats, it's 4% of the world economy, it's 15% of the world population, and we estimate at the World Pensions Council that in the next 5, 6, 7 years, 10% roughly of the overall economic growth will come from Africa. So really, if you only have 0.5% as MSCI or your consultant tells you to, you are really under-investing, and you're punishing a promising continent which may bring in interesting returns to your beneficiaries. So it's not only charity or being humane or helping the Africans, it's really making money in a part of the world that is growing now faster than average and will probably keep on growing faster than the world average in the near future. Of course, infrastructure is illiquid, highly illiquid, but sometimes you can use the weakness of an asset class and turn it into an advantage. So we saw in the previous slide that for listed assets, and you know, 90, 95, 98% of pensions assets worldwide are invested in listed assets like blue chip equity or bonds. You know, Africa is really penalized, but perhaps by investing in African non-listed assets, we could leapfrog that whole problem, because of course these stock exchanges in Africa, they're not diversified, they're illiquid, they're small. That's why Morgan Stanley punishes them, because there's a lack of liquidity and diversification if you invest in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange or the whatever Casablanca Stock Exchange. If you leapfrog above listed bonds and listed equity right into private equity and infrastructure, just like Gavin and his colleagues have been doing in emerging markets for the past 8-9 years, it could be potentially a different picture, because investing in African private equity and infrastructure might give you a wider level of diversification. And so here, I will argue that the time is ripe for Northern Hemisphere pension funds to invest in infrastructure. Of course, today, if you look at the overall allocation to infrastructure, if you look at your average pension fund, it's only 1.4, 1.5% in infrastructure on average. So it is not much. So if you're asking people to put 1% in African infrastructure in the next 5 years, that may seem that something which is far too ambitious. Of course, if you're speaking to a trustee, I guess, in Washington State, that the first initial inclination would be to invest near home, right? So they would want probably to invest first and foremost in US highways, US high-speed rail, airports, and then later on in Africa. So if you really want to reach that 1% in 5 years, of course it's very ambitious, but it's not impossible. And I will argue it's not impossible, and I'm aware of time, I'm going to just wrap up my argument, for political reasons. Because here, literally 2 blocks from that building, 62 years ago, President Eisenhower came up with the idea of, you know, building massive highways across the United States, which may seem like a commonsensical idea, which is very good for US business. Back then, most of the Republican and Democrats in Congress were opposed to him, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which stood to gain the most from building modern highways and trains across America, was also opposed to that interstate highway. So the White House had to fight for a year to convince its own constituents that building modern rails and highways and airports in America was good. Back then, in 1955, America was like literally, in terms of quality of infrastructure, 30, 40 years behind Britain, France, and Germany, which had gone through the Second World War. So it shows you how the world changed. And it was, I would argue that it's purely or mostly through sheer political will that Eisenhower was able to achieve that. And we have a good example now in Europe, because the Europeans are crying about the migrant crisis. And the migrant crisis in Europe is not only costing tens of billions of euros every year for German, French, and British taxpayers. We also had Brexit in England. We also had the far right in Germany 7 weeks ago, which now controls.
I'm only encouraging you to look to your far left, and you have your last speaker there.
If you just do the simple equation, the cost of the migrant crisis, what they're disbursing annually to lodge these migrants in France, Germany, Holland, is only a fraction of what it would take theoretically for the governments of Europe to help enhance and guarantee more pension co-investments in Africa.
Fantastic. Point well made. Thank you very much. And
doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.